All right, so today we are looking at Psalm 45. Psalm 45. Well, let's read the psalm before we take a look at our handout. And the heading, you'll see, is quite long. It's longer than most. For the choir director, according to the Shoshanim, a maskil of the sons of Korah, a song of love. My heart overflows with a good theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. You are fairer than the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and your majesty, and in your majesty ride on victoriously for the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness. Let your right hand teach you awesome things. Your arrows are sharp. The peoples fall under you. Your arrows are in the heart of the king's enemies. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. All your garments are fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. Out of ivory palaces, strings instruments have made you glad. King's daughters are among your noble ladies. At your right hand stands the queen in gold from Ophir. Listen, O daughter, give attention and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house. Then the king will desire your beauty, because he is your Lord. Bow down to him. The daughter of Tyre will come with a gift. The rich among the people will seek your favor. The king's daughter is all glorious within. Her clothing is interwoven with gold. She will be led to the king in embroidered work. The virgins, her companions who follow her, will be brought to you. They will be led forth with gladness and rejoicing. They will enter into the king's palace. In place of your fathers will be your sons. You shall make them princes in all the earth. I will cause your name to be remembered in all generations. Therefore the peoples will give you thanks forever and ever. Well, this is a different kind of psalm that we just read, and the heading on your handout on the first page tells you that this is a celebration of a royal wedding. There is no other psalm like this in all the 150. This unusual psalm, we'll talk about the setting first, this unusual psalm in the poem in the Psalms celebrates the wedding of a king to his bride. And you see a reference to the king several times, verse 1, verses 8 and 9. And the bride is mentioned specifically, she's spoken to, and her wedding garments are described in verses 13 to 15, interwoven with gold, and they are being led in the procession. So this is a song that is in praise of the king and the queen to be. The king, we don't know. Now, let me just say right now, we don't know when in Israel's history which king this was. We have no idea. There are some ideas. But whether we can prove them is another thing. The king is old enough to go to war. You know, he's described as a strapping, powerful man who puts down his enemies. The bride, and here's your first blank, the bride in this case might actually be a foreigner. And that is suggested, that's suggested in verse 10 when the songster speaks to the bride and says to her at the end of verse 10, forget your people and your father's house. That is, forget about where you came from, the land from which you came. Now, usually when a king of Israel or Judah married a foreign bride, it caused a lot of harm. You remember that 1 Kings 11 talks about how Solomon multiplied wives to himself from the Egyptians and from here and there, and how that led his heart astray. Generally, that was a cause of harm. Now, it's possible that in this case, that the queen being celebrated here is an exception to that she might be a foreign woman, kind of like Ruth, or like the Queen of Sheba, who has come to love the Lord. And so this marriage is something that the Spirit inspires the songwriter to celebrate. Now, it is possible that she is not a foreigner, that the phrase about forget your people and your father, that people is to be understood in the regional sense. If she came up from Galilee or someplace like that, just forget about it. But the bigger point is to her, leave everything behind. You've got a whole new life ahead of you in marriage to the king. As I mentioned before, number 2, there are no datable events in the psalm. Traditionally, it's been understood that this is a song about Solomon and perhaps his first marriage. That this was about Solomon and his marriage to the daughter of Pharaoh, which 1 Kings 3, verse 1 talks about. Solomon's palace is said to have been overlaid with ivory. At least his throne is, and we assume other parts of it. There's a reference in the psalm to that the king has come out of ivory palaces. That doesn't seem to fit David's day. David's palace was not quite as ornate as Solomon's would be. So maybe it's about Solomon. Another theory, and I think this one doesn't fit very well at all, but another theory is that this was written about King Ahab up in the north when he married Jezebel. And the reason folks think about that is that verse 12 mentions that there are some representatives from Tyre, which is the city, one of the great cities up in Phoenicia where she's from. But to me, it's hard to imagine that the Spirit would inspire a poem to celebrate Ahab and Jezebel. I mean, you are hard-pressed to find a worse example of ungodliness within Israel's history. When Ahab is on the throne and Jezebel is his wife, that is the lowest point in Israel's history. So, to me, even though Ahab did have a palace of ivory, it seems to me that's not what the songwriter's talking about. At the bottom of the first page, it's interesting that in between the Testaments, in the intertestamental period, after the Old Testament was done written, and after the kingdom of David had collapsed, Jewish interpreters started to think about this psalm as being about Messiah. Now, if the song, let me say right away, there is some connection in this psalm to Messiah. It's another question, though, whether it is a prophecy about Messiah. If it is a prophecy about Messiah, you have to turn a lot of stuff into metaphors. And I don't think that's necessary. I think there's another way of explaining how King Jesus, fulfills these words in some sense, but not by way of prophecy. But it is interesting that going back even before the days of the New Testament, that Jewish interpreters were thinking about this psalm in some way, Messiah was going to fulfill it. All right, go to the inside in the second column, your handout, where we'll note that there are 5 headings to this psalm. That's a lot. 5 headings. Before verse 1, right above it, it says first, there's for the choir director, so that means the choir director at the tabernacle or the temple has been authorized to to arrange it to music as he likes, to schedule it to be sung or played. The second note says that it is according to Shoshanim. Shoshanim is the Hebrew word for lilies. According to lilies. Now that itself is a problem. What's that mean? According to lilies. So lilies might be the name of a tune. I don't know if you've ever noticed that in our hymnals, down in the bottom, sometimes there's an actual name of the tune that you can look this morning. At a lot of them, down at the very bottom, it's usually some Old English name like Ebenezer or Alistair or something like that. So it might be something like that. It could be lilies refers to a style of playing. In the Song of Solomon that celebrates marital love, there's many references to lilies. So there's something, I think, romantic about that connection. The third heading is that it is by the sons of Korah, that they are the authors of it. We've talked about that in the previous psalms in this series. It's also called a miktam, which is a word that comes from a word for skill. So it either means that this is a song that gives you skill, that it teaches you. In this case, I think it's probably better to see that this is a song that requires skill to play. I mean, for a royal wedding, you want your best musicians playing. I mean, you don't bring up the junior high band to play for the king and the queen's wedding. You get your best musicians possible. And then the last heading, there is a song of love. The only time in the Psalms that this heading is used. That tips us off that this is a very unique kind of psalm. So what kind of a psalm is this then? The genre is, this is a royal psalm. A royal psalm, and not just any royal psalm, a royal psalm composed for a king's wedding. There were some other psalms which celebrate the king, and some of them refer directly to Messiah. Some of them refer to David, like Psalm 2, I have set my king upon Mount Zion, and the nations are called to submit to him. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. That's a royal psalm about Messiah. But this one is a royal psalm about a wedding. And there's even a technical name for this kind of a song. It's a, see that there, letter A? The technical name for such a song is an epithalamium. That will be on no quiz I will ever give you. But, so now whoever the couple were, the original couple for whom this was written, the song was no doubt intended to be reused for later royal weddings. It's interesting that the names of the bride and the groom are not mentioned in the song. And the description of the people there is kind of stereotypical. It's not all that specific. So it's intended, like the Psalms, all the Psalms are intended to be used again and again and again. This is the longest poem in honor of humans in the book of Psalms. The only ones longer would be in the Song of Solomon, where the woman sings about her man and the man sings about her woman at great length. Both the groom and the bride are addressed. They are both given a challenge by the songster. So it's like the person who is singing this song to the bride and groom starts off by giving a challenge to the groom, and then he gives a challenge to the bride. In a wedding today, wedding ceremonies, when the pastor gives his little sermon, that's supposed to be a charge to the bride and groom, as before they enter into holy matrimony. It's a little devotional thought to think about what you're about to enter into and the challenges you'll have and the strength you'll find in God for that. So he gives them a challenge, although it's not the sort of challenge that we would use in a wedding today. For instance, the king is told to ride out into battle in all his splendor for the sake of justice. Gird your sword on your thigh and wear your royal regalia and go out and beat the enemies. Verses 3 and 4. Now that's not a literal command to go do that right now. Okay, let's stop the wedding. Now, king, first you need to go out and fight a battle, and then we'll finish this ceremony. It's obviously not a literal command. It's a way of celebrating his prowess and his virtue.
Somewhere there's a verse, Old Testament, that says that if a young man is newly married, that he doesn't have to go to war.
That's right. The first year of his marriage, he is not to be conscripted for war. Yeah, that's right. So that's right. There's something metaphorical about the command here.
That helps put this in context.
Yes, it does. Yes.
So it's not a gesture of celebration rather than a war cry.
That's right. Yeah. It's kind of like our military songs, that to go fight them, kill them, beat them up, sort of. And you think, well, why on earth would you do that at a wedding? Well, have you ever been at a military wedding? Here comes the bride, and all these swords are. The poor bride is walking out underneath all these swords, and but there's something beautiful about that in its own way. All right, so that's the challenge to the king, is to go out and win battles. And then the bride, number 2, is told to set aside all thought of her past life and focus on her new life of joy in the king's house, in verses 10, 11, and 12. Let's talk about the structure. Move over to the column on the right side, on the front page. There are 4 major sections to the psalm. Something very unique. The songster, I'm going to call him the songster because it's the person who wrote the song as well as sings it. All right, he speaks in verse 1, talks about himself. And then he has praise for the royal groom in verses 2 through 9, and then praise for the bride in verses 10 through 15. And then the last 2 verses, the songster speaks about himself again and concludes it. This is the only psalm where the songster, the original composer and the main singer, it's the only psalm where the songster introduces himself before talking about everybody else. he announces the topic. Look with me at verse 1. This is the songster now. My heart overflows with a good theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. So he's alerting us here. My heart is bubbling over, and I've written a poem for the king. Your Majesty, this is for you. And let me go on and tell you what I've prepared. Now, my Bible, New American Standard, has capitalized king. Have you noticed that? Some of you have a New American Standard, and there's a capital K there. And they're doing that because whoever the committee was working on this psalm believes this psalm is a prophecy, a messianic prophecy. So they're applying this to Jesus. The Hebrew Bible doesn't use capital letters, so that's an interpretive point. I think there is a connection to Jesus, I'll talk about later, but I would not capitalize the word king in this spot. All right, so this is an unusual feature. The songwriter introduces himself, and then at the end of the psalm, he talks about himself again. Look at verse 17. This is the only other time I shows up in the psalm. I will cause your name to be remembered in all generations. Therefore, the peoples will give you thanks forever and ever. And there's the songwriter again. I think he's saying, by means of this song, I'm going to immortalize you and your love so that it'll be sung about for ages to come. And then in the main divisions of the psalm, the praise for the groom and the praise for the bride, the shift between those is marked partly by noting the pronouns, the gender of the pronouns. Now in English, if I say you, that could mean you, a guy, or could that mean you, a woman, or could mean all of y'all. In the South, they have y'all. Now that makes it more clear, but yeah, that's right. But in Hebrew, there's a special way to say you, a man, versus you, a woman. And those pronouns change in this psalm. So there's times we know he's talking to the man, and times we know he's talking to the woman. So in verses 2 through 9, all of the yous are masculine. And verses 10, 16, and 17, they're all masculine at the end also. But all of them from 10 to 15, they're all feminine. So in verses number 1 there, the first set of yous refer to the king, and the second set of yous refer to the bride. Now, in a moment, we're going to go into the visual outline chart, but I want to make note of a few other things before we go on. Tracking with a complicated song. Because this song is so unusual, it's notoriously difficult, especially for English readers, to follow if you particularly don't know about the you pronouns changing. In addition to the changes in the pronouns that I talked about, there are also a couple interesting expressions. Like verse 6. Verse 6, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. All on its own, that verse sounds like something out of a hymn, praising the God of heaven. The hard part is everything around it is talking about a king. You king, oh, you God, all of a sudden, and you king, it goes back to the king. It sounds like it's being addressed to God, like it's a prayer that's sort of interrupting what he's saying, but the verses all around it are addressed to the king. Now, this is a key part here. The word for God, there's the Hebrew word is Elohim. Elohim, that's what goes in your blank. The term Elohim does not always refer to the divine being. It usually does, but it doesn't always. It's kind of like in English our word Lord. Lord, we could mean the Lord, or we could mean my landlord, or some lord of a castle in England or Europe. Lord is a title, it's not a name. God is a title, it's not a name. The name of the divine being is Yahweh. God is one of the most common titles, but even in the Old Testament, God is sometimes used not only for the divine being, but for lesser beings. The root idea of the word behind God, this little two-letter thing here, El, the root idea behind that word is power. So the divine being has all power, but there are lesser beings who also are known for their power. So it's sometimes used of angels. Angels are sometimes referred to as Elohim. Even great humans. So the Psalm 82, verse 6, speaking to people, you are gods, means you're mighty ones. Doesn't mean that you're, divine beings. So I think verse 6, applied to a human king, is using this term in that sense. So I would not capitalize God there either. So that's an important note, I think. Now, verse 12. Now, if you don't think that's what's going on, then you got to do one of two things. If you think that's a reference to the divine being, you have to say, all right, either verse 6 is an interruption, that is just a little eruption of praise, and then it goes back to what it's talking about. The problem with that is the context before it and after it's all about a human king. So it's not impossible, it's just awkward. The other way to keep this as a capital G God is to say this whole thing is a prophecy about Messiah. That's an old understanding. It's possible, but I think it has also a lot of problems because you end up having to turn a whole lot of things into metaphors. Yes, question.
When someone reads this and looks at the word Elohim, they would assume he's talking about God.
Not necessarily. Not to a Hebrew reader. Not to a Hebrew reader. To an English reader, yeah, because we're going to capitalize letters. But a Hebrew reader is aware that the word Elohim has a wide range of uses. So, I'll talk a little bit later about how Hebrews uses this verse and applies it to Jesus. But here I just want to note one way of understanding this. Another reference in verse 12. Verse 12 says, the daughter of Tyre will come with a gift. The rich among the people will seek your favor. The daughter of Tyre probably isn't referring to one woman, but to a delegation from the city of Tyre. So if you go on to the next page, the inhabitants of cities are often referred to as the daughter of that city. So how many times in the Old Testament have you heard the phrase, "O daughter of Zion"? You heard that phrase? "O daughter of Zion." Isaiah uses it a lot. He's not talking about some woman. He's talking about the inhabitants. That's the daughter of Babylon is referred to later on. That means the inhabitants of Babylon. So the daughter of Tyre here is probably a delegation from Phoenicia that's come to the wedding. That's, again, a Hebrew idiom. The original audience would be more attuned to that than we are. And then verse 13 also mentions the king's daughter. And you say, no, wait a second, I thought he was just getting married. What's he got this daughter here for? But this is another idiom. This refers actually to the bride. But she's called his daughter not because of subservience or anything like that. This is an alternate way of saying princess. And in the ancient Near East, kings are sometimes called princes. Queens are sometimes called princesses. Think about Isaiah 9, about the Messiah. You shall call his name Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace. Prince? I thought Jesus was a king. He is. He's also a prince. So a queen is also a princess. The terms are more, in English monarchy, these labels are very, you can only be, the queen's husband is not king. He can't be called that. So Hebrew wouldn't have that same kind of rules. So royal titles are used a little bit more freely. So the bride is the princess. She's the queen to be. It's another way of referring to her as the queen. So these are some challenging things for us as English readers. If you were a Hebrew reader, these things wouldn't be as difficult, but it's part of the things that are woven into the poetry. Now the next point, letter C, this psalm has very clear messianic relevance. And I want you to keep your spot here and turn to Hebrews chapter 1, where the author of Hebrews quotes this psalm and applies it to Jesus. Hebrews chapter 1. Chapter 1 of Hebrews is the introduction to the book, as you might guess. Chapter 1s usually are. And beginning in verse 5 of chapter 1, the author of Hebrews starts giving us a whole string of Old Testament quotations, and he applies them to Jesus. Now, some of these verses that he quotes about Jesus are not prophecies. Jesus is going to fulfill all of these verses, but not all of them by way of prophecy. There are some verses quoted that are prophetic about him, and there are some verses that are a pattern that he fulfills. They are, the theological word is they are types. So look with me at verses 8 and 9. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. And then verse 10 quotes another passage. And then verse 13 quotes another passage. When it says of the Son, he says, actually even the word he says is not there in the text. What the author's doing, he's taking passages from the Old Testament that either directly or indirectly speak about the role that Jesus fulfills. So I don't think that this means that Psalm 45 is a prophecy about Jesus, but it does set a pattern that Jesus fulfills. Psalm 45 is not a prophecy about Jesus and the church. King Jesus fulfills these words by fulfilling the type or the pattern that the psalm sets. I think you'll find that, I don't know what percentage. I'm going to throw out a number and then have to edit it later. But when the New Testament quotes Old Testament verses and says Jesus fulfills that, I would say 60 to 70% of the time they're not prophecies. They're types. And I think Psalm 45 is a good example of that. Jesus, now, the thing with the type is that Jesus as the fulfillment fulfills the words more fully than the original people did. He's the ultimate victorious warrior king. I mean, whoever this king was, whether it was Solomon, they had victories, but nothing like the victories of King Jesus. He's the ultimate mighty one who fulfills all the means. In fact, even though verse 6 of the psalm refers to the king as God, a mighty one, I mean, Jesus super fulfills that word. He takes that word to its fullest extent. So that's the thing with typology, is the pattern that was set in the old is exceeded in the fulfillment. The thing that is stepping into that pattern is bigger and better than the original thing. And the union that King Jesus will have with his people will be the ultimate celebration. The biggest, grandest royal wedding that you've ever thought of. You'll be a part of. As part of the bride of Christ. Yes?
So what would be this case, what would be the difference between typology and type?
I'm sorry?
In this case, what would be the difference between typology and the prophecy?
The difference between a type and a... Okay, good question. So a prophecy, let's say you've got a prophet or a poet, and they write or say something, and they know it's about something in the future. It's not about their own time. They know, they're conscious, it's not about them, it's about something later. Or maybe it is about them, but it's about them later. Okay. A type, the author is not thinking about the future. They're thinking about their situation. It's looking back. Years later, people look back at that past and say, that is like this. And I see now God intended that back there to be a picture of what we see right now. That's the difference between a prophecy and a type. Or you could call it a prophecy and a pattern. So a quick word of application before we walk through the outline. This psalm teaches, we learn that every celebration is actually a preparation. Marriage is a joyful occasion. It's worthy of preparation and celebration. And a royal marriage is especially joyful because it signals that the royal family is going to grow and there's going to be a dynasty and there's going to be stability, ideally. Every worthy celebration, whether it's of a king or whether it's your kids getting married or you getting married, every worthy celebration we have on earth is preparation for the greatest celebration we will have when our Lord comes again. Every wedding ought to be a picture of the great union which is yet to come. And you can read in Revelation 19 and 21 about the marriage feast of the Lamb when King Jesus comes again to us. And we too, like the bride is counseled, we too would do well to leave all behind in preparation of our union with him. Well, let's walk through the visual outline chart now, and I'm going to switch over to the screen. So up at the top of the chart, it tells you that the purpose, the psalmist recites a psalm of celebration at a king's wedding, where he extols the godly qualities of the king and exhorts the bride to joyfully abandon all to enter the privileged marriage. This is a royal wedding song written by the sons of Korah during or after Solomon's reign. I think it's after David's day. And there is a messianic connection. It's by means, as I've explained, by means of typology. We talked about the headings previously, how the choir director was authorized to set it to music. The Shoshanim, or the lilies, is a musical style. It's a maskil, a skillful song, and a song of love. Let's get into the body of the poem itself. Verse 1, we have the songster's introduction. And the first thing he does is claim inspiration. He says, my heart overflows with a good theme. My heart is bubbling, literally. My heart is bubbling up with a good topic. And I think he's insisting now, I am being led to say what I'm going to say, because this poem is an unusual poem. This is not like other psalms. It's not a psalm of praise, not a psalm of thanks. It's a psalm for a royal wedding. So he makes a claim of inspiration, and then he announces what this is all about. This is about a royal celebration. The middle of verse, I address my verses, my poetic lines, to the king. And talking here about not the king of heaven, but whoever the royal leader of the nation is. And then he talks about how eager he is to share. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. A ready writer is a professional scribe. I mean, they can write quick, you know. In ancient days, you know, literacy rates varied, and most people could write a little bit, but they were really sloppy, and it took them a long time, and it depended on what you're writing with. But the good scribesmen, they were fast. And, well, my tongue is that way. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to sing, is what he means. So after he makes his introduction, then he gives praise and counsel for the royal groom in verses 2 through 9. And he's going to describe his godly qualities, and then he's going to describe the royal wedding. The godly qualities in verses 2 through 7, he mentions his blessed charm. He's kind of flattering the king. You are fairer than the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore God has blessed you forever. You're a handsome man. You really carry yourself well. And God has clearly blessed you. The reason you are this way is that the Lord's hand is obviously on you. Saul was described in this way. David is described in this way. And of course, who doesn't want to be thought of this way at their wedding? And then the king's prowess and virtue is celebrated in verses 3 through 5. And the celebration is put in the form of a charge to wage righteous war in verses 3 through 4. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one. O mighty one is sometimes a title for God, and sometimes it's just a title for a warrior. In your splendor and in your majesty. So that is, strap your royal blade on and all of your royal battle gear. So wear your royal battle gear and then ride out justly and savor the victory that you'll have. In your majesty, ride on victoriously for the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness. So we're not talking about just being a bloodthirsty warmonger. We're talking about waging war when it needs to be waged. Fighting the good fight. Being a righteous ruler. That verse 4 ends, let your right hand teach you awesome things. Which is, the idea is as you're out in battle and you defeat an enemy this way, defeat an enemy that way, and it's sort of like a aha! There's this sense of triumph and relishing the victory as you're able to outmaneuver your enemies and put them down. The psalmist talks about there being confidence in victory. Your arrows, verse 5, your arrows are sharp. The peoples fall under you. Your arrows are in the heart of the king's enemies. This is a brilliant man, a strapping man. Who wouldn't want to be married to a good fighter like this? Is kind of the idea. And then his divine reign is celebrated in verses 6 and 7. He has an everlasting dominion. Your throne, O God, O powerful one, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. This is language that is used about David's dynasty. When God makes the Davidic covenant with David, your kingdom will be forever and ever, he tells him. So this language is also used elsewhere about the God of heaven, but in this context it seems to be about the descendant of David on the throne. It's speaking about the kingdom in its ideal form. Most of the time in Israel's history, the throne of Israel was not governed so well. Then notice verse 7, it's not only an everlasting dominion, but the king is divinely favored. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness, that you're a good king. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. The oil of joy is, I think, a metaphor for just gladness and happiness. It's not talking about his coronation or just in the victories that you've had. The Lord has given you an exceedingly great joy as you know that his hand is at work and you're leading the nation. And then now we come to verses 8 and 9, and the imagery shifts, and now we're going to talk about the royal wedding, which is why he's singing all of this. The groom's royal wedding garments are now mentioned. First it was his battle garments, and now, to the issue at hand, his wedding garments. All, verse 8, all your garments are fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. Out of ivory palaces, stringed instruments have made you glad. So the first part of the verse is his royal wedding garments, and he's heavily cologned. And then there's the sights and the sounds in the royal palace. There's a band playing as he's moving about from one part of the palace to the other as he gets ready for the ceremony. And then there are royal parties present. Verse 9, king's daughters are among your noble ladies. That is, all around you there are these high officials from different lands who've come to be witness to this event.
It's been pointed out many times that the scripture focuses on the groom in these occasions, and much lesser so the bride, where we in our culture, just like man tends to do, turns things over and around and doesn't put the emphasis where the Lord does. So it's always on the bride, and you always stand up when the bride comes in, and the bride always gets honored in our culture. But it's just, this is the groom. It's different kinds of clothing even. I mean,
Yes, that's right.
this clothing, that clothing. I mean, so you can almost see somebody there taking notes about the groom, but what about the bride?
And she'll get plenty of attention too to come. And I would also say that this wedding isn't just a normal wedding; it's a royal wedding. So of course the king is definitely going to get a royal amount of attention too. I don't know how much. I don't know how far we want to apply that to every other wedding, but in this case, certainly the king isn't going to be outdone by the bride at the wedding. Notice the parties present. You have the daughters of kings are in the company. And then the future queen herself is mentioned. The end of verse 9, at your right hand stands the queen, that is the queen to be, in the gold of Ophir. Ophir is some far off distant place. It's either down in the Horn of Africa or down in Arabia. This is gold that's been mined and traded, and it's been embroidered into her garment. And so the queen is here introduced in the last verse about the king. And now we come to the next part of the poem where it is there's praise and counsel for the king's bride in verses 10 through 15. There is both a charge to the bride in verses 10 to 12, and then a description of the royal wedding in 13 to 15. The charge to the bride, the first thing is there's an appeal to the future queen in verse 10. Listen, O daughter, give attention and incline your ear. So please, your highness, listen to me as I sing this to you. And then he gives her counsel to leave behind her past. Forget your people and your father's house. That doesn't mean never think about them again. It doesn't mean don't care about them, but it means you need to leave. That's right. And you need to leave. That's what Moses said. For this reason, a man, and in this case the woman, shall leave her father and mother and be joined unto the spouse. So there's a counsel to leave her past behind and an encouragement to rest in the king's love. In verse 11, then the king will desire your beauty. Now, he's implicitly complimenting on how beautiful she is. And what will add to that beauty is if she's not, I don't want to be, the inner beauty will match her outer beauty. And then there's a call for her to submit to her royal husband. The end of verse 11, because he is your Lord, bow down to him. Again, the husband here, this is not just normal husband-wife relationship. This is a royal marriage. He is king. She will be queen, but will not have the same authority. It's sort of like in England today, the Queen of England trumps her husband. Her position is better than, what is it, Prince Philip, is that right? Yeah. He's a duke, yes.
He was.
And when they have a fight, he says, put up your dukes. And, by the way, do you know what that's where that saying comes from? Put up your dukes and your knights and your, Anyway. And then verse 12, there's encouragement to glory in the royal celebration. The daughter of Tyre will come with a gift. The rich people among the people will seek your favor. You, wife, bride, your, as feminine. There's dignitaries here that have come to see all of this. The delegation from Tyre has brought a gift fitting for a queen. There are wealthy people who've come to honor you and to seek your favor. You're entering into a whole new experience of life. So this counsel to her is not, I don't think they're really thinking that she's going along grudgingly. This is a way of sort of everyone celebrating the goodness of what's about to take place, or the change of station of life that she's about to enjoy. And then, just as the wedding was described when talking about the king, now the wedding is described with a focus on the bride in verses 13 through 15. The bride's royal wedding garments are mentioned in verse 13. The king's daughter is all glorious within. The princess is all glorious within. Her clothing is interwoven with gold, the gold of Ophir that we read about a couple verses earlier. And then verses 14 to 15 describe the procession to the royal chamber where the ceremony will take place. There's great attention given to the bride in verse 14. She will be led to the king in embroidered work. The virgins, her companions who follow her, will be brought to you. She has a garment with a great train, and she has a large train of bridesmaids as well, who are accompanying her on this very special moment. Verse 15 mentions the sights and sounds of the procession. They will be led forth with gladness and rejoicing. They will enter into the king's palace. Everything is choreographed and scheduled, and it's not fake. It's really is a very joyful time. Well, now we come to the end of the poem, and the songster brings it all to a conclusion. He's going to mention himself again, and he's going to change focus also. Verse 16, he starts to speak again to the king. In verse 16, as he makes an assurance of the royal dynasty, in place of your, that's masculine, your fathers, O king, will be your sons. You will make them princes in all the earth. That is, this is why I think that this can't be David, because David's father was not a king on the throne. So there's the reference, you had kings before you, you're going to have kings after you. You're going to get married, and now the dynasty is going to continue. So that wouldn't apply to David, but it could to Solomon or a king after him. So one of the functions of the marriage is that the line might continue, and that the Davidic covenant, the promise that you will never lack a son to sit upon the throne, as David was promised. So here the songwriter assures him of this royal dynasty. And then the songwriter then says that his intention in this song is to immortalize the royal family's name. Verse 17, I will cause your name to be remembered in all generations. Therefore the peoples will give you thanks forever and ever. Or the peoples will acknowledge you forever and ever. I'll cause your name to be remembered. How's he going to do that? By writing this song. He's performed it, and now he's written it, and the choir master now gets it. It's going to be used again and again. And the name, I think, is more about the name of the house of David than it is. Because isn't it interesting that nobody's name is mentioned in the song? Solomon's not there. They're not named. But we know about whose dynasty this is. And now, again, I don't think that this psalm is a prophecy about Jesus. But boy, I tell you, there's some really, really, really big language in this psalm. And after a while, you kind of look at the kings of Judah and Israel, and you say, is that true of him? And you could say, well, in a poetic way, it's true. But you know what? This is the thing about typology. These things which are poetically true about some of the kings of Israel become literally true of Jesus. Jesus super fulfills these words. A lot of times, these songs which will talk about the kings of Israel being great and powerful and strapping, sometimes it's kind of like David trying to wear Saul's armor. It's just kind of big, clunky. He doesn't really fill into it. It was given to him, but it doesn't really fill into it. But King Jesus is going to fulfill these words. Again, not by prophecy, but by pattern. And he will fill out the fullness of these things that no one else could.
So it wasn't true, it wasn't true per se, but it was just some metaphoric expression.
Oh yeah, there's certainly metaphors, yes, for sure. Well, I think there really was a royal wedding. That this was written for a real event, but they're kind of being praised in
Some sort of metaphoric way of
partly. Yeah. All right, let's have a word of prayer and ask the Lord to bless what we've studied. Father, we're thankful for the time we've had this morning to look at this unusual psalm, a psalm about a couple. We don't know their name. We weren't there, and yet here it is now 3,000 years later, and we're still reading about that glorious day and the glorious thing you did in bringing them together. And it reminds us that there is a greater day coming, a greater celebration, the most wonderful royal wedding ever, when King Jesus will come and take his people to be his bride. And so we shall ever be with the Lord. And Lord, as we prepare for that everlasting union, we pray that we would take the counsel that the bride was given here to forget all about our past life and the way life used to be, and get prepared for life with him forever. We ask it in Jesus' name.